fact, I shouldn't even kid. This is very serious. This is no magic trick like you've been seeing here tonight.
Joe Burrows, known as the Amazing Joe, wasn't just a magician. He was a stuntman, a daredevil, a man willing to risk his life to amaze an audience. On Halloween night 1990, he planned to pull off the most dangerous stunt of his career. Joe's inspiration came from the legendary Harry Houdini, one of the greatest escape artists of all time. But there was one trick even Houdini couldn't conquer: being buried alive. Joe Burrows, however, wasn't afraid. In fact, he saw Houdini's failure as his opportunity to succeed. He wasn't just going to repeat the stunt, he was going to take it further. Instead of being buried under dirt alone, he would add 7 tons of cement on top, making the escape even harder. If he succeeded, it would be a historic moment in magic. If he failed, well, no one wanted to think about that. The setup was as dramatic as the stunt itself. The stage was built at Blackbeard's Family Fun Center, a small amusement park in Fresno, California. It wasn't a grand Las Vegas stage or a high-budgeted televised event, just a modest Halloween show with a crowd of excited spectators and a camera crew ready to capture history. Everything was designed to build suspense. The eerie atmosphere, the fact that it was Halloween, and the sound of the shovels scraping the ground as a grave was dug right before the audience's eyes. Joe stood beside a clear acrylic coffin, allowing the audience to watch every moment of the stunt. He was going to let the world see the struggle. Chains were wrapped around his body, with the ultimate goal being to free himself before the crushing weight above sealed his fate. As the dirt and cement was prepared, there was an unmistakable tension in the air. Some of the crew members had doubts. Was the coffin really strong enough to handle the weight? But Joe was confident. He had performed similar escapes before, though never on this scale. He believed in his own skill, his timing, and his preparation. This was meant to be his defining moment, the trick that would put his name in history books. He lowered himself into the coffin, gave one last nod to the crowd, and the lid was sealed shut. The audience held their breath as the first shovels of dirt hit the top. Joe Burrows was about to attempt the impossible. This was supposed to be the biggest moment of Joe's career, a live, death-defying stunt that would prove he was more than just another escape artist. But there was one fatal problem. From the moment the dirt and cement started piling on top of the coffin, something felt off. To the untrained eye, everything seemed to be going as planned. The dirt was falling, the audience was on edge, and the cameras were zoomed in on the grave. But the whole trick depended on the structural integrity of the coffin and its ability to hold that weight for just long enough to let Joe escape. Except it couldn't. As the last layers of cement were poured in, the coffin suddenly collapsed. The weight of 7 tons, 14,000 pounds, came crashing down in an instant. The thick acrylic shattered like glass, and before anyone in the crowd realized what had happened, Joe Burrows had been crushed. At first, no one reacted. The audience expected suspense. They thought that maybe the long pause was part of the trick. This was live entertainment after all. But as the seconds stretched on, something became deeply unsettling. There were no signs of movement from inside the grave. No hand breaking through to the surface. No last-minute escape. Still, the cameras kept rolling. Even the stagehands hesitated, unsure whether this was a genuine emergency or just part of the show. But as the silence grew heavier, the reality of the situation set in. It wasn't until one of Burrows' crew members rushed forward toward the pile that the tension snapped into panic. The stagehands scrambled, shovels in hand, trying to dig Joe out as quickly as possible. The cameras continued to capture the unfolding horror, but it was already far too late. The sheer weight of the cement had trapped Burrows instantly. There was no chance for him to even begin to escape. Unlike Houdini's failed attempt, where assistants had barely pulled him from the dirt in time, Joe had no air pocket, no space to move, no chance for survival. By the time the crew had reached his body, Joe Burrows was completely motionless. The cameras finally cut away, but it was over. What started as a high-stakes magic trick had turned into one of the most horrific moments in television history. The 23rd of August in 2010 started like any other day in Manila, the bustling capital city of the Philippines, though everything soon changed when a tourist bus full of people became the target of a dangerous and desperate man. The man was Ronaldo Mendoza, a former police officer. Once he had been respected for his service, but he felt wronged after losing his job in a corruption case. Frustrated and desperate, Mendoza took a drastic step to clear his name. That morning, he boarded a tour bus carrying 25 people, mostly tourists from Hong Kong, and took them hostage. Armed with an automatic rifle, Mendoza's demands were simple. He wanted his job back and his name cleared. But what he didn't expect was that his actions would soon turn into an international incident, one that would be broadcast live to millions of people. As soon as the news broke, media outlets rushed to the scene. Cameras were everywhere as reporters provided constant updates, each hoping for the perfect shot of the bus stranded in the middle of the deserted road. At first, it seemed like the situation might be resolved peacefully. Mendoza was talking to the police, and the authorities hoped to calm him down. Negotiations were tense but ongoing. While Mendoza seemed calm, everyone knew that the situation could change in a heartbeat. The police worked carefully, trying to meet Mendoza's demands while keeping the hostages safe. But as the hours passed, tensions began to rise. And no doubt, the amount of cameras filming everything only stressed out Mendoza even further. Though, unbeknownst to the police, Mendoza was able to watch these live broadcasts from a television inside the bus. He saw everything the authorities were doing, and this obviously created a very dangerous situation, as every time the police made a move, Mendoza knew about it almost instantly. When the negotiators tried to calm him down or make promises, Mendoza could see if their actions matched their words by watching the live news. There was a real competition between the news outlets to be the first to break updates, to capture the most dramatic footage, and to give viewers the most gripping version of the story. In a sense, the hostage situation became more of a spectacle than actual crisis. Still, amid the chaos, some of the hostages were freed. Early in the standoff, Mendoza had released a group of them as a show of good faith. Most of them were elderly or young children, whom Mendoza believed were less valuable as bargaining chips. After nearly 10 hours of tense back and forth between Mendoza and the police, the situation was beginning to unravel. His demand for his job back had not yet been met, and he was becoming increasingly agitated. He believed the police were not taking him seriously, and the live broadcast of the unfolding events only fueled his desperation, as he could see the SWAT teams preparing for an assault. Mendoza's frustration reached a boiling point when his brother, Gregorio, was arrested near the scene. Gregorio had been trying to mediate the situation, but the police suspected he was helping his brother. The media cameras captured his arrest live, and Mendoza, watching from inside the bus, saw absolutely everything. This was the final straw. He declared that negotiations were over. He shouted threats, and the lives of the 15 remaining hostages were now in immediate danger. Then minutes after, gunfire could be heard from the bus. The SWAT team then moved in as soon as they heard the shots, and the assault was chaotic and terribly executed. The SWAT team struggled to break into the bus, using sledgehammers and crowbars to force open the doors. The process took far longer than expected, and the live cameras captured every single mistake. Viewers watched in horror as the police seemed to be completely incompetent and unprepared. Whilst inside the bus, it wasn't known how many of the hostages were still alive, if any. Mendoza looked at the TV inside the bus once more, and upon seeing the police trying to break down the door of the bus, more shots rang out. For over an hour, the botched rescue attempt played out on live television. News anchors tried to make sense of the chaotic images, but it was clear to viewers everywhere that basically everything had gone terribly wrong. The SWAT team struggled to gain control of the situation, and with each passing minute, the chances of saving all the hostages grew slimmer. That after what seemed like an eternity, the police gave up on trying to enter the bus through the door and threw in tear gas to flush Mendoza out. And it worked, with snipers who were watching from above instantly ending Mendoza and the crisis as soon as he stepped out the bus. But the real damage had already been done. 8 of the hostages' lives were lost in the chaos, and many others were left traumatized, with some of the news stations trying to film the best shot of Mendoza as he lay there lifeless. Picture waking up one morning, turning on your television, and seeing a 60-ton military tank rolling through the city streets, crushing cars and flattening streetlights like they were nothing. It looked like something out of a war movie, but it wasn't. It was real. And the man behind it was Sean Nelson, a troubled veteran with nothing left to lose. Sean Nelson's life hadn't always been this way, though. Born in 1959 in San Diego, California, he had a normal upbringing, but there was always something restless about him. In the late 1970s, he enlisted in the US Army, where he learned how to operate heavy machinery, including military vehicles. But after just 2 years, he was discharged, and from there his life began to spiral. At first, things seemed fine. He became a plumber, started his own business, and even got married. But over time, everything began to fall apart. His wife left him, his plumbing business failed, and a motorcycle accident had left him in chronic pain. And he blamed the doctors who treated him, even trying to sue the hospital at one point. He truly felt like the world was against him, and as his anger grew, so did his obsession with the idea of taking back control. People who knew Nelson described him as someone who was drawn to danger. He had a habit of taking extreme risks, sometimes for the thrill, sometimes just to prove that he could. He'd apparently weaved through traffic at dangerous speeds on his motorcycle, and once he had dug a 15-foot hole in his backyard, telling neighbors he was searching for gold. No one really knew what he was thinking, but it was clear that something inside him was unraveling. By May of 1995, he had reached his breaking point. His money was gone, his health was failing, and his mind was slipping deeper into paranoia. He had spent months telling people that he was going to do something big, but no one had taken him seriously. On the night of May 17th, he finally made his move. At some point that evening, Nelson drove to the National Guard Armory in San Diego. The facility was supposed to be secure, but that night there were no guards on duty. The tanks inside were locked, but not well enough. No one stopped him as he climbed onto one of the M60 Patton tanks, a massive Cold War era machine built for the battlefield. It should have been impossible for him to get inside, let alone to start it, but his military training gave him an advantage. While most people wouldn't even know where to begin, Nelson knew exactly what to do, and within minutes, the tank's engine roared to life. Now he had a new problem. The tanks had been parked close together, making it nearly impossible to maneuver out the lot. Instead of trying to steer carefully, Nelson did the only thing that made sense to him. He plowed straight through. He smashed through fences, ripped through barriers, and within moments he was free. A massive steel machine rolled onto the streets of San Diego, and for the first time in history, a civilian had stolen a military tank and had taken it for a joyride. Millions of people were about to witness one of the most bizarre, terrifying, and unbelievable live broadcasts in history. The first calls to 911 must have sounded like a joke. A man had stolen a tank. Officers must have assumed there was some kind of mistake. But then more calls came in. Reports from terrified drivers something massive was plowing through traffic, flattening cars, ripping through fences, and crushing anything in its way. At first there was no police chase. Squad cars weren't built to handle something this powerful, and no officer on duty had ever been trained to stop an active duty war machine. By the time authorities realized what had happened, Nelson was already deep into the city, and before long, news helicopters were in the air, their cameras locked onto the site below. And behind the controls sat Sean Nelson with a kind of reckless abandon that only a man with nothing to lose could have. It was as if he had one goal: to destroy. The police were powerless to stop him. Their weapons were useless. Handguns, even rifles, couldn't penetrate the tank's thick steel armor. But Nelson wasn't giving them time to think. He steered the tank straight through residential neighborhoods, rolling over anything in his path. Some managed to swerve off the road, barely escaping, though others weren't as lucky. One driver, trapped in his car as Nelson's tank rolled toward him, had only seconds to make a desperate leap out the vehicle before it was completely flattened. Another motorist was forced to reverse at full speed, barely keeping ahead of the war machine bearing down on him. Officers scrambled to figure out how to stop him. The only thing they could do was wait for Nelson to make a mistake. For nearly half an hour, Nelson continued his rampage, causing hundreds of thousands of dollars of damage. But then, he made one mistake that would end it all. As Nelson tried to cross the center divider on the highway, the tank's tire tread slipped. The 60-ton machine lurched to one side and got stuck on the concrete barrier. He revved the engine, trying to shake it loose, but the massive vehicle wasn't going anywhere. And now, for the first time in over 30 minutes, he was vulnerable. Officers saw their chance, climbing onto the tank's exterior. The hatch was locked from the inside, but they weren't taking any chances. Using bolt cutters, they pried it open, and as they swung it open, guns drawn, Nelson looked up at them. There was no surrender, no negotiation, and with no way of knowing what he might do next, the officers fired. A single shot hit him in the shoulder, sending him collapsing inside the tank. They dragged him out, his lifeless body slumped over. Live on television, millions had just witnessed one of the most bizarre, destructive, and surreal police chases in history. The streets were wrecked, cars were obliterated, but somehow, through it all, Nelson had not managed to take a single life. Almost immediately, the public demanded answers. How had one man, without any weapons or backup, managed to break into a National Guard armory and steal a literal tank? Why weren't there guards on duty, and how could a tank this dangerous be left in a position where someone could just climb inside and drive away? More disturbing was the fact that no one had been able to stop him. If Nelson had chosen different targets, if he had deliberately gone after people instead of just causing destruction, the loss of life could have been catastrophic. The San Marino Grand Prix in 1994 was just another stop on the Formula One calendar, but instead it became one of the darkest weekends in the sport's history. Ayrton Senna, one of the best drivers in the world at the time, was getting ready for the main event, but before he even got into his car for the race, the atmosphere at the track was already tense. There was a feeling in the air that something was off. The first sign of trouble came on Friday, the 29th of April, during a practice session. Brazilian driver Rubens Barrichello, one of the F1's rising stars, lost control of his car at a high speed. He hit a curb, sending his car flying through the air. It flipped, smashed into a barrier, and landed upside down. For a moment, it looked as though he might not survive. Senna rushed to the medical center, desperate to see if his friend was okay. Barrichello was unconscious, his nose broken, and his teeth stained with red, but miraculously, he survived with only minor injuries. The crash had been terrifying, but it was just the beginning. The next day, during the final qualifying session, the tone of the weekend changed completely. Roland Ratzenberger, a 33-year-old Austrian driver, was fighting to secure a good starting position for the race. He was pushing his car to the limit when disaster struck. A minor mistake on a previous lap had damaged his front wing, but he didn't realize how bad it was. As he sped down the track nearly 200 miles per hour, the weakened wing snapped off, and without that crucial piece of the car, it became uncontrollable. He crashed head-on into a concrete wall at full speed. The impact was brutal. The moment his car hit the wall, the live broadcast cut away. The camera panned to a distant shot of the wreckage. But it was clear this wasn't just another crash. Ratzenberger's head slumped forward, motionless. He wasn't moving at all. Senna was in the Williams team garage watching on the monitors. As soon as he saw Ratzenberger stay there motionless, he knew. The medical team rushed onto the track, performing CPR right there in front of the cameras. Viewers at home didn't know quite what they were seeing, but the silence from the commentators told them everything. Within minutes, Ratzenberger was airlifted to a nearby hospital, and an hour later, the news would be confirmed.
Ratzenberger succumbed to injuries sustained in the accident which took place at Imola Circuit during Saturday qualifying practice, April the 30th.
Senna was devastated. He had never seen someone die on a Formula One track before, and now, just 24 hours after Barrichello's crash, it had happened. When Senna returned to the race's headquarters, his mood had changed completely. That night, he called his girlfriend, Adrienne, and told her he didn't want to race anymore. He was shaken and uneasy. Even Formula One's medical chief, Professor Sid Watkins, urged him to leave. "You've been world champion 3 times. You're obviously the quickest driver. Give it up and let's go fishing." Senna replied, "Sid, there are certain things over which we have no control. I cannot quit. I have to go on." He didn't actually want to race, but he knew he had to. On the morning of the race, Senna woke up and did something unusual. He picked up an Austrian flag and placed it in his car. If he won, he planned to wave it in tribute to Ratzenberger. As Senna climbed into his car to begin the first race, he was surely feeling a mix of emotions. He had just seen death up close and knew it might come for him next. And then the lights went out and the race begun. Just seconds after the green flag waved, a collision at the first corner sent debris flying into the air. Pedro Lamy and JJ Leto tangled, their cars smashing together in a violent crash. A loose tire, flung by the force of the impact, bounced over the safety fence, landing in the packed crowd and injuring several spectators. Despite the carnage, the race continued, but there was too much wreckage on the track for the drivers to keep going at full speed, so the safety car was deployed. It was a much slower, everyday day road car that forced the F1 drivers to crawl around the circuit at dangerously low speeds. The real problem is that Formula 1 cars are designed to operate at extreme temperatures. Their tires need to be scalding hot, hundreds of degrees, so they can properly grip the track. Their brakes rely on heat to function efficiently, so cooling down too much makes everything harder to control. For the next few laps, Senna led the field at a reduced pace, waving his car back and forth in a desperate attempt to keep heat in the tires. But it wasn't enough. By the time the safety car left the track, his car wasn't in peak condition. Still, he pushed forward, and after everything that had happened that weekend, he wasn't going to back down. Then, on the 7th lap of the race, as he approached a corner at nearly 190 miles per hour, something went horribly wrong. Without warning, Senna's car veered off the racing line. In a fraction of a second, it shot straight ahead, skidding off the track and heading towards a solid concrete wall. At 135 miles per hour, the car slammed into the wall. The impact was brutal. The front of the vehicle crumpled instantly, sending pieces of shattered suspension and bodywork flying in every direction. Then, the moment that sealed Senna's fate happened so fast that at first, no one even realized it. One of the front wheels broke loose on impact, still attached by its suspension arm, a thin but incredibly strong metal rod designed to hold the wheel in place under extreme forces. In a freak accident, that metal rod snapped and shot backwards like a spear. It pierced through Senna's helmet, killing him instantly. The wheel itself, still attached by remaining tethers, bounced off the wreckage and crashed down onto the cockpit, crushing part of his helmet. The crash itself lasted less than 2 seconds. At first, the commentators assumed Senna was unconscious. The footage replayed from multiple angles, and there was no immediate panic in the voices of those covering the race. Formula 1 had obviously seen crashes like this before. Cars were designed to absorb impacts and to break apart so that the drivers wouldn't take the full force of the collision. There have been dozens of crashes that looked just as bad, if not worse, and drivers had walked away nearly unscathed. But something was obviously different. In most crashes, even if a driver was injured, they would make some kind of movement, waving to the marshals, trying to unbuckle their seatbelt, showing some sign that they were conscious, but there was nothing. But then, Senna's helmet twitched slightly. For a brief moment, it looked like a sign of life. Maybe he was regaining consciousness. Maybe he had been knocked out and was coming to. But it wasn't a moment of intent, it was a reflex. A spasm from his body shutting down. The tension in the broadcast grew heavier as the seconds dragged on. Medical teams were already sprinting towards the wreckage. Just 16 seconds after the crash, Chief Doctor Sid Watkins was at Senna's side, peering into the cockpit. The world watched in real time as marshals tried to check for a response. But there was none. They pulled open his visor, revealing his face for the first time since the crash. That was when Watkins saw the injury. Red trickling down from Senna's nose, a clear sign of serious trauma. He placed 2 fingers on Senna's neck, feeling for a pulse, but there was nothing. The cameras were still rolling, millions of people watching live. On the track, the medical team worked frantically. They performed an emergency tracheotomy right there in the cockpit, trying to clear his airway and get him breathing again. Then, just as they moved him onto the stretcher, his body convulsed slightly again. To those watching, it looked like another sign of life. Behind the scenes, the medical team already knew this was a fatal crash. The damage was just too severe, but officially, Senna was still alive. He was airlifted to a nearby hospital, and for 37 agonizing minutes, the world waited for the news. At 6:40 p.m. local time, the news was confirmed. Ayrton Senna, one of the greatest drivers in the history of Formula 1, had died. Senna's funeral was one of the biggest ever seen in Brazil. 3 days of national mourning were declared, and over 3 million people lined the streets of Sao Paulo to say goodbye. His coffin was draped in the Brazilian flag, carried by some of the greatest drivers in history: Alain Prost, Emerson Fittipaldi, and Gerhard Berger, men who had once been his fiercest rivals. When the reality TV show Cops filmed in Boynton Beach, Florida, they expected another day of routine police work. The long-running series documented real officers in action, capturing raw and unscripted encounters with crime. But in August of 2009, they captured one of the most shocking sting operations ever put to film. To understand just how disturbing this moment was, we need to go back to the man at its center. Michael DiPolito was trying to turn his life around. He had made mistakes, big ones, but by 2009, he believed his past was behind him. He had a good job, a beautiful wife, and a fresh start. But sometimes, no matter how much you try to escape the past, it has a way of catching up to you. Years earlier, Michael had been caught in a world of scams and deception. He wasn't a violent man, but he was a hustler, making money in ways that weren't exactly legal. In the early 2000s, he ran a fraudulent investment scheme promising huge returns to people if they invested in foreign currency trading. Though instead of making them rich, he took their money and spent it on himself. It didn't take long for the authorities to catch on. In 2003, Michael was arrested and convicted of organized fraud and grand theft. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison, but that wasn't the worst of it. When he was released, he was placed on 28 years of probation. That meant for the rest of his life, one wrong move could send him straight back to prison. Despite the weight of his past, Michael was determined to build something better. By 2009, he had recently married Dalia Dippolito, a woman who truly loved him. But soon, strange things started happening, things that he couldn't explain. It started small, a traffic stop that made no sense. One day, the police pulled him over and told him that they had received an anonymous tip that he had drugs on him. Michael, knowing he had done nothing wrong, was obviously confused. The officers searched his car, but they found nothing. He shrugged it off as a misunderstanding. But then it happened again. Another tip, another search. But this time, the police found something. A small bag of white powder tucked away in his car. Michael was stunned. He swore it wasn't his, and the strangest part was that it was hidden in a way that was almost guaranteed the police would find it. Michael was still on probation, meaning that this little crime would guarantee him prison time. But instead of arresting him, the officers hesitated. They truly believed he was innocent. As they agreed, there was something off about the whole situation. The way Michael reacted, the way he and his wife broke down in tears, and the strange pattern of anonymous tips leading the police straight to him really didn't feel right. The officers let him go with a warning, but the experience obviously left Michael shaken. Then the phone call started. Michael's probation officer received a flood of anonymous reports claiming he was violating probation. They said he was using drugs, dealing them, and committing crimes behind closed doors. Every time he was called in for questioning, and every time there was no evidence. The accusations just wouldn't stop. It was as if someone was desperate to see him locked up. But why? Michael and Dalia knew something was wrong. The false reports, the attempts to frame him, none of it made sense. He felt like he was being pushed towards disaster, but he had no idea just how close he was to real danger. Because behind his back, someone wasn't just trying to ruin his life, they were trying to end it. Somewhere in Boynton Beach, Florida, a man sat in his car waiting. He wasn't a friend, a co-worker, or a police officer. He was a hitman, or at least that's what he wanted people to think. In reality, he was an undercover detective, part of a secret police sting. Officers have received a disturbing tip. A woman was trying to hire a contract killer to murder her husband. That woman was Dalia Dippolito, Michael's wife. She thought she was meeting a real hitman, someone who could make Michael disappear for good. When she slid into the passenger seat of the hitman's car, she got straight to business, speaking about her husband's murder with the same casual confidence as if she were ordering food at a drive-thru.
What do you say about that? Okay, when it's all done, I was going to get $3,000 from you today, and $3,000 when it's all done. Right. So it's not like I look at once, just don't get $3,000 more. Which is why I said that, between now and when it's done, you have to have an option to change your mind, even if you change your mind, talking to
There's no changing, there's no, determinate already. I'm positive, 5,000% surely.
That was all the police needed. They had their evidence, and they could have arrested Dalia right there and then. But instead, they came up with something even bigger. They weren't just trying to stop the murder-for-hire plot, they were going to expose it in a way that no one would ever forget. Early the next morning, the Boynton Beach Police Department invited a television crew from Cops to document the entire operation, and with cameras rolling, police staged a crime scene outside the Dippolito home. Patrol cars lined the street, and yellow crime tape stretched across the driveway. Officers were scattered around the property, speaking in hushed tones as they prepared for the moment she would arrive. There was even a detective standing by the front door, ready to deliver the shocking news. Inside, Michael Dippolito was very much alive. After the police informed him of the plot against his life, he had agreed to go along with their plan. Now, while his wife was at the gym, just as she had arranged, the scene was set. All they had to do was wait for her to come home. When Dalia arrived, she was met by an officer who immediately stepped forward to stop her. her. His face was serious, his voice calm but firm.
Is your husband Michael? Okay, I'm sorry to tell you, ma'am, he's been killed. He's been killed, man. I'm sorry.
No, he's not.
Listen.
No.
Try to calm down. Listen, right now we need to get you to the station.
No.
We need to get you to the police station. We can't let you see him, man. We have to do our job. If you want us to find his killer, okay?
It was a heartbreaking display, the kind you might expect from a woman who had just lost the love of her life. But for the millions of viewers watching at home, they knew it was all an evil woman's act. As the officers consoled her, they told her she needed to come down to the police station to answer some questions. Still shaking, she agreed, wiping her tears as they led her away. But the moment she stepped inside the interrogation room, everything changed. Instead of being treated as a grieving widow, she was met with a different kind of energy.
You're going to jail for solicitation of first-degree murder of your husband.
I didn't do anything.
Did you hear what I just told you?
I heard what you said. I didn't do
Everything,
anything.
listen to me. Everything has been recorded. You were photographed in the convertible when you sat in his car. What do you want to do? What do you want to do here?
She kept up her act, playing the innocent, confused, and heartbroken wife. Though the officer wasn't finished, he continued, explaining that they had her entire meeting with the hitman on video. They had her handing over the money, making sure she had an alibi, saying she was 5,000% sure. This wasn't speculation, this wasn't a setup, this was cold, hard evidence. Then came the final blow. Purposefully, the police walked an alive and well Michael in front of the open door of the interrogation room. Even after being exposed, she refused to break character.
Oh my God. Come here, please. Come here. Mike, come here. Come here, please. Come here.
Can't fix it.
Why not? I didn't do anything
I
to
heard
you.
you.
Mike, come here, please. Come here.
Okay, thank you. I'll take her back to booking, please.
But the act was over. The police weren't playing along anymore, and the moment she thought she had orchestrated a life without Michael, a future with his money, had been completely flipped on its head. From the moment she was taken into custody, Dahlia's defense team started spinning a different narrative. According to them, she hadn't actually been trying to have her husband killed. Instead, they claimed the entire thing had been set up for a fake reality TV show, orchestrated by both her and Michael. In this version of the events, she wasn't a would-be murderer, she was an actress playing a role, and the police had fallen for the act. But there was one massive problem with that defense. If this was really a reality TV show stunt, why had she begged the undercover officer to go through with the murder? Why had she handed over the cash? The video evidence was damning, and despite her lawyer's best efforts, no one believed it. In 2011, Dahlia Dippolito went for trial for solicitation to commit first-degree murder, facing up to 30 years in prison. The trial didn't last long. After just 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty. Dahlia was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but that wasn't the end. Dahlia's legal team immediately began working to overturn the conviction, arguing that the intense media coverage had made it impossible for her to get a fair trial. And in 2014, they caught a break. An appeals court threw out her conviction, ruling that the jury selection process had been flawed, and she was granted a new trial. For the next few years, Dahlia's legal battle dragged on. Her second trial in 2016 ended in a hung jury, meaning no verdict was reached. But by 2017, prosecutors were ready to try again. At her third trial, Dahlia once again sat in court, listening as the jury was shown the same damning footage. This time, the verdict came in swiftly: guilty. This time, she was sentenced to 16 years in prison, slightly less than her original sentence, but still a devastating blow. She was immediately taken into custody and sent to the Lowell Correctional Institution, a woman's prison in Florida, where she remains today. Before Gary Plauché became known across America for possibly the most shocking moment on live television, he was just a regular man, a father and husband living in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. To actually understand why Gary did what he did, you need to know who he was and what mattered most in his life. Gary Plauché worked hard, kept to himself, and above all, focused on his family. He wasn't the type to ever cause trouble or make a scene. Gary's pride and joy were his children, especially his son Jody. Gary and Jody had a close relationship. They did a lot together, and Gary tried his best to set a good example for his son. He wanted to teach Jody how to be respectful, kind, and strong. They shared simple moments like watching sports or playing outside. Family time was incredibly important to Gary, and he made sure that his children knew that they were loved. As a father, he might have been protective, but he never imagined the type of threat that his family would one day face. Like many parents, Gary wanted his son to stay active and develop good values, so he enrolled Jody in karate. Karate was supposed to teach him discipline, self-control, and respect, qualities that any father would want for their son. At the karate studio, Jody met his instructor, Jeff Doucet. Doucet was a young man who seemed dedicated to the kids he taught, earning the trust of both his students and their parents. Over time, Doucet became more than just Jody's instructor. He became a familiar figure in the Plauche's family life. He started showing up at family gatherings, joining them for dinners, and even taking Jody out on outings. To Gary, Jeff Doucet seemed trustworthy. He thought his son was in safe hands, learning valuable life skills from a reliable teacher. But what Gary didn't know was that Doucet's interest in Jody wasn't just about karate. Gary had no reason to doubt Jeff. No one did. But looking back, many would later wonder if there were any warning signs. It's often hard to see danger when it comes disguised as a friendship. Gary trusted Jeff with his sons, never realizing how that trust would be betrayed. Jody Plauche was just 11 years old when his life took an unimaginable turn. On March 16, 1984, Jeff Doucet picked up Jody without his family's permission or knowledge. He drove them out of Baton Rouge, their hometown, making their way across state lines in an effort to disappear completely. By the time anyone realized Jody was gone, he and Jeff were already hundreds of miles away, hidden from the world. For Gary, this news was like a nightmare come to life. His son was missing, and he had no idea where he was or if he'd ever see him again. The hours soon turned into days, and the search for Jody became urgent. Police launched an investigation, and soon, news of Jody's disappearance was all over Baton Rouge. Friends, family, and neighbors rallied around the Plauche family, but as the days passed, hope began to fade. Where could have Jeff taken him, and why? These questions haunted Gary every minute, every hour. He couldn't sleep, he couldn't eat, and he was constantly consumed by fear. And what's worse is that Jeff Doucet's plans went beyond simply taking Jody away from home. He brought Jody to a motel in California, far from anyone who could help him. Over the next several days, Jody would endure all manners of assault at Doucet's hands. And after several agonizing days, law enforcement was finally able to locate the two and bring Jody to safety. Authorities tracked them to the motel, rescuing Jody and arresting Doucet. For the Plauche family, this was a moment of relief, but it was only the beginning. Jody was safe, but the damage had already been done. He had experienced things that no child should ever endure, and Gary knew that this incident would stay with them forever. And he couldn't stand the thought of Doucet simply going to trial, sitting in a courtroom, and possibly even walking free one day. As the court date approached, Gary's frustration reached a boiling point. Friends who visited him noticed that he was no longer the calm, easygoing man they once knew. He was distracted, short-tempered, and constantly preoccupied with thoughts of Jeff Doucet. On the 16th of March 1984, exactly 1 month after Doucet had kidnapped Jody, he was being transferred from California back to Baton Rouge, where he would stand trial. Word had spread, and the local news media was ready to cover Doucet's arrival. Baton Rouge residents had a vested interest in the story, and people wanted to see the man responsible for one of the most disturbing crimes their community had ever seen. Among the crowd that day was Gary Plauche, but he wasn't there as just another father seeking justice through the court system. He had an entirely different plan, a plan that no one else knew about. With his heart racing and his mind made up, Gary took his position by a row of public phones, knowing that Doucet would walk past him. Then Doucet appeared, flanked by 2 detectives. This was the man who had hurt his son, who had shattered his family's peace. As Doucet passed, Gary acted. The bullet hit Doucet, and he collapsed instantly. The entire scene was captured on live television, broadcasted directly to homes across Baton Rouge and beyond. "Why, Gary?" someone shouted. "Why?" Following the shooting, Gary Plache was taken into custody. He cooperated fully with the authorities. He didn't try to deny what he had done, and he never expressed any regret. Gary was calm, almost serene as he answered the officers' questions. To him, it felt like he had fulfilled his duty as a father, even if it meant facing severe consequences. Public opinion was divided. Some people, especially those who were parents themselves, felt that Gary had done the right thing. They saw his actions as an understandable reaction to an unimaginable situation, and they admired his courage to confront the man who had hurt his son. When it came time for Gary's case to be heard in court, he was charged with second-degree murder, but then through a plea bargain got it lowered to manslaughter. Many expected a harsh sentence, as his actions had been public, premeditated, and undeniably deliberate. But his defense team argued passionately on his behalf. They described him as a loving father pushed to the brink, a man who had been overwhelmed by grief and betrayal, and they empathized with the emotional turmoil that had driven him to act. The judge, perhaps sensing the extraordinary pain that Gary had endured, gave him a very lenient sentence. Gary was ultimately only given 5 years of probation with no jail time, allowing him to return to his family. The decision stunned many people across the country, as on one hand, it was a compassionate act, though others felt it was an unfair exception, one that sent a message that people could bypass the legal system if they had a strong enough motive. At the age of 67, Gary agreed to do an interview, where he stated he had no regrets and would easily do it again.
Do you regret killing Jeff Doucette?
No.
No. Would you do it again?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes.
And that concludes today's video. If you want something else to watch or listen to, here's a video of mine that YouTube thinks you'll enjoy. Thanks for watching.